It looks like most people have settled in, Brother Greg. So without further ado, I think it's a good time to start.
Thank you all very much. It's good to be with you and just have a few reflections. First of all, I want to thank Allison and Alegria and the entire team for their dedication to these 2 days. And welcome to my brief remarks. So Thich Nhat Hanh says that enlightenment is when the wave knows it's the ocean. And so the same could be said of wholeness. And wholeness is the goal in the kinship we all seek, all our organizations across the globe. Wholeness happens when the wave knows it's the ocean. And none of us are whole until all of us are whole. As the great Frank Buckley tells us, it's a wellness model. It's about brain health and hope as something that's communal. So people healing in a community where they feel cherished. And the cherishing part is so essential. So as Dr. Ross so eloquently told us yesterday, COVID has unmasked so much. It's revealed deep and structural inequality. So as he said, we can never go back. And yet, as Dr. Ross posits, where are we headed? And where are we headed as the Global Homeboy Network, of which this gathering is a signature part? So we stand at the margins with impacted persons, and we turn our ear to them, as Dr. Ross says, and committing all over again to full inclusion and agency, profound belonging, and real change. So about 2 days ago, I was listening to a podcast, and as happens these days, somebody asked about, how did you fare during the pandemic, or during the part where we were locked down anyway. And this guy said, we got closer, which is what you might say about your family unit, because you were forced to kind of live on top of each other. We got closer. And growing closer is about reducing distance that exists between us. And that's our task. Our task is to reduce distance, reminding each other that separation is in fact an illusion. So I was sitting at my desk just a couple of weeks ago, and a homie came in who I didn't know. I'd never met him. And he was 23 years in prison, 4 days out. And so he was sitting in front of my desk, and I'd never met him before. And I'm writing on this little piece of paper, as I do 93 times a day, drug test any Friday at 10. And as I'm writing, I said, hey, tell me, how'd you hear about Homeboy? And he said, oh, some female told me. Yeah. Her kids were fathered by you. And I stopped writing. I said, say what now? And you could see the look on his face. He was trying to gather all the words that were kind of floating in the air. And he goes, well, no, that's not right. Oh, wait. Her kids were baptized by you. And I said, well, that's a little bit different. And the two of us, we exploded in laughter, what the homies would call laughing from the stomach. And distance was bridged. We got closer. And suddenly there was no daylight that was separating these two strangers who had never met before. And so I looked at him, I said, forget the drug test, you start tomorrow. The beloved community, a place of belonging and connection. around here, we say that, it's kinship that brings us closer. It is the relationship that heals. And we all know that good relationships keep us happy. And as Frank would say, resilient and thriving. And isolated loneliness, in fact, leads to shorter life and unhappiness. So we gather every year, as we have, as the Global Homeboy Network, because we were always in search of a new container. We want a new frame through which we see stuff. Okay, so take the vaccine resistance thing as an example. So there's one guy, we were going back and forth and trying to convince him to get vaccinated. And we have vaccination days, as I'm sure you've heard about. And we have COVID testing every Tuesday, as we did today. And he says, well, I'm going to wait. I'm going to, do some more research. This was like a month ago. And I said, well, what are you going to do? You're going to go to medical school? And I was getting frustrated. And I said, so what are you going to do? You're going to Google COVID? Are you going to, check out Instagram? Are you going to see what Facebook is saying? Then finally he looks at me and he says, I got trust issues. And I thought, bingo, that's what it is. Certainly trust issues are born of generations of racial inequity when it comes to access and the delivery of healthcare and medical care. But it is also a measure of injury. We have trust issues when we are injured. And how our folks shoulder a burden which is just intensely outsized. And so we stand in awe, as I've said many times, at what our folks have to carry, rather than in judgment at how they carry it. Oscar Romero said, there are many things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. So we need new containers. We need a different frame through which to see stuff. In March, I was taking my morning walk and I was trying to navigate a very narrow sidewalk. And there was a wall on one side and a street on the other side, and two very large, vaguely menacing dogs on a leash were walking towards me. So I was trying to give them room, and I fell off an embankment and I slid face first into the street, and I destroyed my glasses, and I ended up having two very large black eyes, and I needed stitches and scratches and scrapes. And I went to the urgent care, and I told the doctor who was stitching me up, I said, Doc, I work with gang members. I need this middle finger. And she was able to save it. But for 2 weeks, easily, I looked like hell. I'd be in my office. I'd have 2 to 4 to 5 homies at any given time in this office. And they'd go, my God, what happened to you? And I told them the story about, the vaguely menacing dogs. And every single one later on would get me alone. They'd sidle up to me and they'd say, really, what happened? Well, they trusted me, but they kind of don't trust the world. They have trust issues. And so how do we address the injury that undergirds those issues? So the vaccines are interesting, because we label things and we want to avoid that. So Charles Barkley, the basketball player and the sports commentator, said, the unvaccinated are assholes. And then I heard a guy on a pundit on a podcast called them morons and idiots. And it's against the spirit of this place at Homeboy to engage in that because it's demonizing. That's the wrong frame. That is an incorrect container. And demonizing is always untruth. It's always the opposite of who God is. So it's not about ignorance, it's about injury. So even before the vaccines became possible, there was one homie here, and I said, hey, you know, when we get the vaccines, which seemed to be right there almost, and I said, are you going to get vaccinated? He said, oh, hell no. Mark of the beast, the sign of the beast. And he quoted something from scripture that said, do not inject yourself with anything foreign, or I don't know what the hell. So I told him that maybe, you know, needles and shots and hypodermics, you know, and syringes kind of didn't exist when whatever the hell that quote comes from. And then another guy, when I was going in to get vaccinated, big tears in his eyes, the guy had been in prison for a lot of years. He said, Pops, please, I beg you, don't get vaccinated until you watch this video. So, you know, it was a YouTube video, and my yikes-ometer went off, and it was just wackadoodle dandy. And some doctor, a woman in a theater, standing ovation, the most wacko stuff. Turns out later on, she was one of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Okay, those two guys eventually got vaccinated. Why? Because I won the argument? No. Because somebody had convinced them? No. Because they were long enough in a community that cherished them, that held them, that told them that they mattered, that held the mirror up and returned them to themselves daily. Because of that, they were whole enough to trust and to get vaccinated. And none of us are whole until all of us are whole. The wave finally discovering that it is the ocean. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to contribute a homily written in an anthology. So they gave me a gospel passage, and it was love your enemies. And it reminded me of my spiritual director, a homie named Sergio, who I've known for 25 years, and we communicate daily. And he was saying, you know, I think that Jesus invites us to do him one better. So, for example, love your enemies. And then Sergio says, how about not having any enemies? That does Jesus one better. I had another friend say, you know how in the gospel it says, love your neighbor as yourself? Well, the truth is, we don't love ourselves very well. So how about this one? Love your neighbors as you love your child. Way better. And as Sergio says, Jesus is not threatened, nor his message diminished when we do one better. He, in fact, delights. Everything is about something else. It's not about ignorance. It's about injury. We don't have enemies. We have injuries. We don't have hate. We have wounds. We don't have fear. We have the shared ruin of our common human brokenness. And one day we will choose to no longer punish wound, but to heal it. We've settled for describing stuff, and we should hold out for explanation. We've settled for merely pointing things out, But in our network, we want to point the way. Sometimes it's hard to get to moral compass because we spin our wheels in moral outrage. We want to invite folks to their own wholeness, inclusion, and agency. I'm reading an excellent book, I'm almost done, and it's magnificent, and it's called The Cruelty is the Point. And it's by an exceptional writer, Adam Serwer, who's writes for The Atlantic. And these are just a collection of essays that he's written during the course of the last 4 years. And he kind of has an intro to each essay. And they're magnificent, and they're searing essays, and they are historically deep and researched. The cruelty is the point, he says. And well, really, the cruelty is not the point. The cruelty is an indicator. The cruelty points beyond itself. It's telling us what to look at. So don't just describe, get underneath it, as the homies here say, find the thorn underneath. Injury sometimes presents as fear. Don't address the fear. Address what undergirds the fear. And homies have taught me this over the nearly 40 years that I've been working with gang members, because I learned early on that gang violence was about something else. It was about a lethal absence of hope. It wasn't a problem. It was, in fact, an indicator. It was the cough that told you you were allergic to your cat or had lung cancer. And it's important not to settle for description. Hold out for explanation. Just a few weeks ago, maybe, I was a guest speaker for a whole week at Chautauqua Lakeside, which is in Ohio. Every morning for an hour, I spoke to a very large group, and I was on a bandstand in the open air and trees and lawns, and people had the chairs out, and Lake Erie was over to the left of me. And on the very last day, the guy running the thing got up and he said, "Look, be careful with that tree over there, because birds keep attacking people." And then an old man in the front row says, "No, they're not attacking anybody. They're frightened, and they're protecting their nests." So description, birds attacking you, and explanation, frightened and trying to protect their nest. A bad diagnosis has never led any of us to a healthy treatment plan ever. So where we start will always determine where we end up. Where do we start? We belong to each other, and there are no exceptions to that. Everyone is unshakably good. We start from there and continue on. And demonizing, as I said, is always untruth and the opposite of how God sees things. God sees no villains, and God has no enemies. God only sees children and only sees injury and longs for the wholeness that seems to only really happen in a cherishing community. So we seek a beloved community, not a behaving one. We just had a big ass fight earlier in the middle of Tom's presentation. And it, in 33 years, we've maybe had a handful of those, but it was a big one. And we still seek a beloved community and not a behaving one. We help each other find our common shared harmonious strength. We invite everyone into the harmony of the whole. And truthfully, only healing ends homelessness, not houses. Only healing reduces crime, not cops. You still need houses and cops, but healing is essential and foundational. And that's what we believe here at Homeboy. We welcome everyone, even the knuckleheads who started that fight, into the beloved community. We recognize language, symptom. We recognize everything is pointing beyond itself. And only in this beloved community can you actually heal injury and wound and repair and restore severed belonging. And that is God's dream come true. And so in this network, as we bring this to a close, we love people into wholeness, and we walk them home to the harmony of the whole. When I used to have hair, it was black. And there was a kid I named Speedy, who was really responsible for it turning white. And he had a hard life. He lived in the projects, great mental anguish, injured, severed belonging. If his story had been a flame, you would have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you would get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of Speedy's childhood. And so he was kind of a daredevil, and he'd go into enemy neighborhood and go like this. And a couple times I'd have to drive over and rescue him and throw him, in the back seat of my car and have him lie down and drive him out of harm's way. He was chasing death, as the homies say around here. And I can remember once I was about to say mass, and it was 5:05, and the senoras I could see inside the church were tapping their feet and looking at their watches. And then Speedy comes into the sacristy as I'm throwing on my alb, and he just leans on the counter and he says, G, I just don't care whether I live or die. And I said, Miko, I wish I could have this conversation right now because I have mass. It's going to have to do for you to know that I care whether you live or die. And he seemed to consider this, and it seemed to work. Well, several hours later, I was in my office at Dolores Missions many years ago, and I always kept the front door open, and homies could see me at my desk. And so he saw me and he came in. He stood in front of my desk. He says, what I'm about to tell you, well, I don't want it to turn your forehead red, which, often happened. And I said, what happened? And he said, I walked Anna home. Oh, it just turned my forehead beet red. I was madder than hell because I knew that Anna was a young girl that he was sweet on, and he walked her home, but she lived in his enemy's worst part of the projects, and she deposits him into the second floor. And then he comes down, and only then is he spotted by, 10 enemies from a rival gang over on that side in Aliso village. And they chase his ass through Aliso village, and they throw sticks and stones and empty bottles of 40-ounce bottles of beer, and they don't call him Speedy for nothing, and he gets out of the way. And he's out of breath, and he gets to First Street, and he's about to cross the street in relative safety when a woman named Yolanda Gallo stops him. And she doesn't know him, but she knows that he currently shouldn't be where he currently is. Ven pa acá, mijo, come here. And he kind of hangs his head low a little bit. And she says, ¿Qué está haciendo aquí? What are you doing here? And he doesn't say anything. And then she says this to a kid who is a perfect stranger. In Spanish, she says, if anything happened to you, it would break my heart in two. I see you playing with your nephew in Pecan Park. That kid is lucky to have you as his uncle. I see you feed the homeless men at Dolores Mission Church. What a kind and generous thing that is. And then she returns to the earlier refrain, pero te digo una cosa. If anything happened to you, it would break my heart in two. Kindness, tenderness, the notice of God, the only way we can find harmonious strength, and we get closer, God's dream come true. And he was loved into his own wholeness, and Yolanda reached into his mental anguish, and she presented to him a beloved community of belonging and kinship. In vivo, in her very presence, she presented that. So then he came to the church and he told me all that. And then he looked at me and he says, you know what, G? That shit made me feel good. And of course it did. Beyond injury, wounds, and the shared ruin of our common human brokenness, that shit makes you feel good. Well, years after that, he married his childhood sweetheart, and he had 3 kids. And I found him a job in Richmond, California, where he had a horrible job, which was cleaning the inside of oil tankers. And then he became the supervisor, and then he had his own crew, and he went back to school at night. And so one day he called me and he says, hey, I'm in LA and I want to take you to dinner. I'll pay. And since that was so historic, I said yes. And so we went to a modest steakhouse, and we're talking, and I said, wow, you're so busy, you're working all the time, you're going to school. What's your weekends like? Like, what do you do on Sunday, for example? And he was very excited to say that at 9:00, he and his wife and 3 kids, they went to 9:00 mass. And I was impressed. And he said, after that, we go to Mimi's Cafe, and everybody, the kids, they can order whatever they want. They be having bomb-ass French toast there. And then afterwards, he says, this may sound weird, but we go to Barnes & Noble bookstore. And everybody, my wife, me, all the kids, you go pull a book off the shelf, and you sit in one of their chairs and read the book. They be having comfortable chairs at Barnes & Noble. And he says, well, you know my ass, I'm just cheap. So I never buy a book. I just tell them, read as much as you can in 2 hours. Then you put the book back on the shelf, and Noah Bethel will be back next Sunday to continue where we left off. And then he kind of shifts gears a little bit, and he says, and this is how old this story is. He says, the kids wanted the most recent edition and book of Harry Potter. So I broke down and I bought it. I couldn't believe I did. And then he says, you know what we do every night? I turn the TV off and I sit in my recliner, and my 3 kids sit on the couch and they read out loud. The oldest one, she reads a whole page. Then she hands it to her brother and he reads a paragraph. Then they hand it to the baby, who can get through a sentence with some help. Then they pass it back, page, paragraph, sentence. And then he gets very moved by the telling of his story. And he says, and I just sit in my recliner, listening to my kids read out loud. And he holds his face in his hands and he just quietly weeps. And I let him cry. And he cries until finally I reach over and I grab his arm and I say, son, you have a good life. And he looks up from his half-eaten steak and he says, I do. And beyond injury, wounds, and the sheer ruin of our common human brokenness, a good life, resilient, harmonious strength, loved into wholeness, finally dawning on the wave, discovering it is the ocean. None of us are whole until all of us are. So as the Global Homeboy Network, let us recommit to find a new container, a new way of seeing, as the old spiritual puts it, to look beyond the fault and see the need, to walk each other home to this community of beloved belonging, God's dream come true, a good life. I am so eager to see all of you in person next year. God bless you all.